So honestly, did any of you wonder why I was telling that really hard story to the kids during the children's time? Maybe thinking, why is he talking about that stuff with the kids? It's a tough story. Mr. and Mrs. Potiphar and Joseph and that almost love triangle thing. It's hard. And there's other things in that story that are even tougher, like slavery and human trafficking, the abuse of power, and the possibility of sexual exploitation. These are dark aspects of life amongst humans. And I bet there's none of us here who haven't heard worse in real life. So we know these are real things. There's nothing new about the things people do to each other, the way they'll take advantage of each other, the way people in power can sometimes do things terrible to people they have power over, to get their kicks at the pain and suffering of others. So when I tell stories like that, and when I tell them to our kids, grandkids, I believe the children will take in the story at the level they're able to grasp it. And over time, those stories, which are real stories, and honestly not as bad as some of the stories you might hear if you turn the news on, help them get ready. Help them prepare for living in this world in which sad and terrible things happen, and where we need to stand up for love and justice and helping people know how to be decent human beings. That's really important. We have to help our kids be ready to live in the real world, for good and for bad. And stories can help with that. They can be a less scary way to talk about really scary stuff. Anyone here ever seen the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? You know that one? Yeah. Naomi knows that one. It's a good story. I can remember back when I was a minister at Chalmers in Windsor, we actually chartered a city bus and took a busload from the church over to Detroit to see the musical live. Joseph was Donny Osmond. He was buff. He spent most of the show with a bare chest, so you got to see exactly how buff he was. And he sang well, too. The musical tells the story of Joseph, the favorite son amongst 12, sired by Jacob, with several of his wives. Remember what I was saying a couple of weeks ago? The Bible understanding of marriage and our understanding is a little bit different. So Jacob had a whole passel of wives and had a bunch of kids by different women, and that was okay, apparently. Joseph's brothers, except for Benjamin, hated his guts. They were just jealous of him, and they got rid of him, like I said earlier. They kidnapped him, they faked his death, and they sold him off to slave traders who carried him off to Egypt. And I said this before too, that the buying and selling of human beings, as despicable as that is, has been going on in most parts of the world for as long as humans have been around. And it's still going on. You'd be surprised how close we are to places where that's going on today. In our times, it often involves children who are put to work in factories producing consumer goods. You and I probably have some of those goods in our house. Or maybe wearing something today that was made by a kid who's essentially a slave. It's everywhere. Human trafficking is also a means by which literally millions of people, both women and men, are transported away from their homes and exploited for the sex trade, for prostitution. It's despicable. It's definitely unfair and worth whining about. And again, it happens not too far from where we live. Joseph, back to him. Joseph was comparatively fortunate for a while. Potiphar, the guy who bought him, put him to work in domestic service. Relatively safe, no risk kind of work to do. And because he was smart and apparently good looking like Donnie and was kind in his interactions with people, it wasn't long before he rose up through the ranks and was running the place for Potiphar. And he wasn't a free person, but he had a lot more latitude than some of the slaves that were now below him. Those things are going maybe as good as they can go when you're a slave. But then it starts to get more unfair. Joseph was subjected to unwanted sexual advances. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand about this one, but I'll bet there's people in this room who have been subjected to unwanted sexual advances. Men and women both. Happened back then, happens today. Person with power, person who has influence, person you're not sure you can say no to, makes a demand and you don't know what to do. What could Joseph do? If he said, yeah, okay, that would betray his own honor, it would betray his sense of faith, it would betray his master who trusted him with so much, and would also run the risk of getting caught. But if he refuses, he runs the risk of ticking off this woman who has a lot of power in that house. So he's really in this place right between a rock and a hard place. Almost no easy way. Well, life is like that, right? Sometimes there's no easy way. There's a faithful way. There isn't always an easy way. The people in his life had a lot of power to make his life even more difficult. Like I said, we know this kind of awful stuff has gone on in our lifetime, goes on today, which is why I think it's really important that our kids, our grandkids, children we care about, know this is a dynamic of human interaction and know that it's okay to say, no, I don't want that. That's yucky. That's terrible. Get away from me. Because what the person is demanding or asking for is evil. Kids need to know they have the right to resist, to say, no, no thank you. This is where I run the risk of getting almost political. 3 weeks in and he's already doing it. One of the unfortunate things about our current government's decision to withdraw the new sex ed curriculum is that the old curriculum, which was being put back into use, has a lot of good things about it, but it doesn't have anything in it about teaching consent. So our kids and grandkids will not learn about that at school. They need to know that it's okay to say no. I heard a great interview on CBC Radio this weekend with a young woman who took part in one of the protest walkouts at one of the high schools in Ontario. And she said, because she's in grade 11 or grade 12, I think, she's disappointed that the students younger than her will not be taught about consent. Not be told that every person has the right to say no to unwanted physical attention. They're not going to be taught that anymore. Just think about that for a minute. If we believe that every person is a child of God, every one of us, all of our kids, all of our grandkids are children, precious children of God, precious in God's sight and in ours, wouldn't it follow that we teach those kids to see themselves as precious? And the right to touch them, to mess with them, is something that you don't give up? They get to say no. They should know about that. It's okay to say, no, don't even go there. They don't have to be subject to the unhealthy appetites of a predator just because our government doesn't want to teach them how to say no. I personally think that our kids, our grandkids, the kids that we love, they need to know when something that is being tried on them is wrong. And you know what? They also need an appropriate vocabulary to be able to say, Mr. So-and-so put his hand on my... One of those embarrassing words you don't want me to say in church. But if the kid doesn't even know the word, how do they say, I didn't like it when they did that? They've got to be very clear, very specific, or else nothing can be done. Where did the person touch them? What did they try to do? Court's going to want to know the words. And if our kids don't know the words, it isn't fair. Joseph said no. He said no to Mrs. Potiphar. And in his case, it wasn't a movie producer or music mogul or politician or hockey coach or minister that tried to have their way with him. Because that stuff happens, right? It was the bored spouse of a wealthy landowner who was used to getting what they wanted. When push came to shove, nobody even asked Joseph for his side of the story. And probably nobody would have believed him anyway. This still goes on today. This goes on every bloody day. People want to say, but they did that to me. When somebody tells a story like that, we got to listen to them. Even though we don't want to know about it, we don't want to hear it, we got to give them the grace of listening to them, of believing them, of helping them. It's been shocking in recent months and years, for me at least, to hear these stories of really famous people that I used to look up to. I used to have tremendous respect for. I thought they were great entertainers who have been revealed to have these not-so-secret lives of abusing people for their own sick purposes. You've all heard the stories too. People we used to think were really cool. And you find out, wow, how did they get away with that? Well, we know how they get away with it, right? Because when someone says, they did that to me, and we don't believe them, or we don't want to hear about it, or we don't want to hear those words. I hate hearing those stories. I hate finding out the people that were kind of my heroes have these dark, twisted, evil side to them. But you know what? I'm also glad the stories are being told, because maybe that makes it more possible for our kids and grandkids to say, you know what? Something's going on, and it's not right. People need to know they're going to be believed. And it's not just about sex, although that's the stuff that grabs the headlines, right? There are these terrible stories of elder abuse where paid caregivers, even relatives, take advantage of older people, take their money, steal their identities to take out loans and mortgages, get credit cards, lines of credit. They sell off their belongings and property. Sometimes it's emotional or physical abuse. The person feels trapped because someone who's supposed to be taking care of them is taking advantage of them. Anybody who's being misused, abused, mistreated, treated unjustly needs to know when they talk about it, they'll be believed. They need to know that we will believe them and we will help them. I don't even like talking about this stuff. I don't even like remembering when I get up on a beautiful Sunday morning that us human beings, we can be so awful to one another. I don't like thinking about that so much. But what I do like thinking about is we can also be incredibly tender and kind and good to each other. We can be there for each other. We can listen. We can say, yeah, I believe you, when folks are suffering. And that's so much of what our faith is all about. When the precious little ones are being downtrodden. I mean, Jesus said, suffer the little children, come unto me. He didn't say, let's make the kids suffer. He said, let them come close to me. They matter. When we live in this world where so many awful things can happen to people we know, to us, it can be a challenge to stay faithful, to be like Joseph, who kept his faith no matter how the world was messing with him. He stayed a faithful guy, and that's pretty cool. I asked somebody in the last couple of weeks who is facing significant health challenges, has a really tough diagnosis that they're living with. I said, has that had an effect on your faith? Like, what's that done to your faith? Because I've seen it. I mean, it can go one of two ways, right? I've seen it, that sickness and grief, injustice, all the bad things in the world can weigh us down, can have us screaming, it's not fair, and can cause our faith to shatter, to fall away in little crumbly pieces, because it's not supposed to be that way. And in my job, I hear it, people will say, how can there be a God when my uncle died so young? How can the Creator possibly be all loving, all kind, all good, and let such terrible things happen? Those are legitimate questions, heartfelt questions. And the more you hear the bad stuff about the world, the more you may wonder, how does God let that stuff go on? Maybe another question, though, is, does God promise to rescue us? To save us from all the crap that can happen? Is there like a holy umbrella over us because we go to church that shelters us from all the bad that can happen? Have any of you experienced life that way? Because you're a faithful Christian, nothing bad happens to you? If there's anybody here that's like that, I want to live with them. I want to be under that umbrella too. Well, we can ask Joseph. If you read his whole story in Genesis, it is a series of one really horrible event after another. People mess with him all the time. And he comes out of it still just trying to be a good guy, believing in God. And there's no sign that the umbrella ever saved him from anything. The amazing thing, and this is maybe even more beautiful than Donny Osmond's bare chest or that amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, is that in Joseph's case, all the injustice only seemed to make him resolve to be more kind, to do more good, to try to be of help to people who were having a hard time. And that also seems to be true of the person I was talking with in the last 2 weeks. He told me that his illness, his awareness of mortality, of his own human vulnerability, is making him feel that much closer to God and that much more aware of the beauty, the wonder of creation, and how cool it is when we're good to each other, how cool it is when we're kind and loving with each other. Those things affirm a deeper kind of faith. I love when I see that kind of faith in people. It's a more mature kind of faith. It's a kind of faith that says, yeah, stuff's going to happen. Awful things happen. I'm not going to be protected from all this stuff. But even so, God is with us. God is with us in the midst of the most horrible things that can happen. God shares our pain. God shares our misery. I suspect God even whines and says, it's not fair. Because sometimes it's not. I want to tell you about a guy named Cesar Abraham Vallejo. He was a Peruvian poet, born in 1892. He was the 11th child born to parents who were of mixed Spanish and Quechua Indian origin in the mountains in Peru. Get this. His grandfathers on both sides were Spanish priests who took Quechua Indian mistresses. So he knew, it was ingrained in him before he was even born, right? His family, he knew about racism. He knew about exploitation. He knew the horrible things that can be done to people. He knew how unfair life could be. He grew up in abject poverty, every day experienced injustice and cruelty and hunger. He watched his mom die, some of his older siblings die, basically of poverty, deeply affected by all these things. Even so, he was a smart guy, faithful guy. He managed to get an education. Eventually, this half Spanish, half Quechua Indian from the mountains of Peru up in the Andes moved to Paris and made a living as a poet, as a translator. And with his writings and his letters, he became friends with people like Pablo Picasso and began to live a totally different kind of life. He never forgot where he came from. He always believed that when you write, when you tell a story, when you make a poem, you should be doing it to let the world know that change needs to happen. He never forgot about people. He spent, even though he made some really cool friends like Picasso and artists and writers and the intellectuals of the time, he spent most of his life feeling like an outsider, that no one really knew him or accepted him. Maybe they were fine with him, but he didn't know because he'd grown up programmed to believe that because he was Quechua, there was something wrong with him. I want to share one of his poems with you. Don't worry, it's in English. I love this poem because it speaks so beautifully of a God who is with us. Even in the midst of the worst that humans can do to each other, all the suffering and pain that we can live in and live with, God is with us, and God is actually deeply affected by the hard things that go on in this world. The poem's called Dios, which of course is Spanish for God, and that's the only Spanish word in the poem. It says, I feel God travel with me. When the sun sets and on the sea, together we walk as it grows dark. We are all together, but walk like orphans. But I feel God. And God gives color to my life. God is kind and sad, like those who attend the sick and dying. God whispers like a lover in distress. Oh, God's heart must hurt for God's creation. Oh my God, though I've just come to you, I love so much as it grows dark. And in the balance within the heart, I wail and weep for frail creation. And you, God, what do you weep for? You who love with your immense and whirling heart, I bless you, God, because you love so much, because you never smile, because your heart must ache as time continues. Amen.